Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice. We are your co-hosts, Rebecca Strauss and Sarah Willey, two employment lawyers who spend their days guiding employers through all of the challenges that workplaces offer.
Well, welcome to part 2 of our 2-part series on workplace violence. Part 1, we had special guests, Sergeant Orkema and Deputy Chief Boyson, and boy, was that helpful.
It was unbelievable. I mean, really, I'm so grateful for the insight and experience that they were able to provide to us and help to answer a lot of questions, quite frankly, Rebecca, that we've gotten over the years. And so I know I found the information they provided to be helpful going forward, and I'm sure our listeners did as well.
Yes, lots of peace of mind, lots of things for the to-do list. So what can lawyers offer to this conversation, Sarah? I think we learned during the last episode, we recognize our limits.
That's exactly right. Yes.
We do have limitations. But what can lawyers offer to this conversation to help the employer community further when it comes to workplace violence?
I guess probably the most favorite thing that employment lawyers like to talk about, right, Rebecca? And that's policies.
So to be fair, our clients love talking about them too.
Are you sure?
Right?
Are you sure?
Well, we'll find out how many folks watch this episode. You and I love talking about policies. We'll see who watches and takes notes. But I do think that folks appreciate a good policy, and there's some really good reasons for that. So let's just be clear on what we can accomplish with policies, particularly in such a serious matter,
right?
And what we can't accomplish with policies. I think one of the primary benefits of working out a policy in this area is that it forces leadership to think through.
That's such a good point.
Right, how they want to address the issue. It forces the conversation, right?
Yeah, it forces the conversation and decision making, right, yes, as well. And that is an invaluable point, and I talk to clients a lot about that. Sometimes it's the process of creating a policy that provides more value even than the writing on the paper at the end, right? It forces the conversation, it gets people into a room to think about what is okay, what is not okay, what we're going to do, who is going to be in charge, et cetera. And that's invaluable. But also, I don't want to minimize the benefit of having the information on the paper as well, particularly in events when HR folks and others are concerned about workplace violence or potential workplace violence. So the first thing I'll say is, and I'll just say it out loud, you and I don't think for a minute that if an individual has the motivation to come into a workplace and commit horrible acts of violence, they're going to first look at the handbook to see if it's against a policy and that might stop them. Right?
We wish it could.
Yeah.
We wish a policy could have that power, of course, but we're realists, right? And we should all be realists here. That's just not going to happen.
Right.
But we don't see, thank God, we don't see those types of situations arise nearly as much as employees making potentially threatening.
That's right.
Behavior, conduct on social media, that sort of thing. Right?
Yes, that's right.
So how does a policy come into place when those types of events come up?
Right. And in that case, it really is helpful for an individual, for an HR rep, for example, to be able to take a deep breath, remember that they went through the process of thinking through what a policy should say, putting it on paper, and then having the ability to pull it out and see what it says, right? I've gotten lots of phone calls saying, so-and-so, our receptionist, we just found out has been bringing her gun to work and having it in a drawer, and we don't even know really, we haven't decided whether it violates our rules or not, so what am I supposed to do about it? Okay, so it's helpful to have done that ahead of time and then have it in front of us.
And in other situations, when it comes to workplace violence, potential workplace violence problems, Sometimes people are scared, and it's a moment of anxiety, particularly if they think there's a threat that has been made. And when anyone is going through a moment of anxiety, sometimes the thinking is a little less clear, a little less linear, right? So it does help to pull out the policy and say, okay, when we were in a place of calmness, right, how did we think we would approach this? And it really helps focus the conversation and almost always leads to an answer.
Okay.
Right? Okay.
So we've done a great sales job for the policy, right?
Do we really need to sell policies as human resource professionals? We're just making ourselves feel better, because before we embarked on this episode, we were talking amongst ourselves about what value, right? What is the value of lawyers in this conversation?
So given that, right, what Rebecca, so first of all, I usually see two policies in this space. Sometimes they're combined as one. The first one is some sort of broader policy talking about violence in the workplace, okay?
Yeah.
And the second is information or language more specific to weapons.
Right.
And those could be combined into one policy, but I usually see them as two separate policies. So let's take the broader workplace violence policy first.
Sure.
What would you recommend people include in that policy, right? If they're starting from a clean piece of paper, putting pen to paper, what should they include?
By the way my brain works, you said pen to paper and I picked up my pen. Very suggestible.
You're ready.
I'm an advertiser's dream. Okay. So there's four major categories that go into a workplace violence policy. We're going to break down each one in more detail, don't worry. But the four major policies are: who is the policy going to cover?
Yep.
What type of conduct is the policy going to cover? What will the consequences be of a violation of the policy? And then we want to include in this one reporting, a requirement for reporting.
Sure.
And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail, because obviously sometimes people are very nervous to report, right? And how do we handle that?
For obvious reasons. If there's been a threat, then they're concerned about their own safety. Okay,
Yes.
excellent.
Okay.
So the who. Let's start with the who.
Let's start with the who.
Who should it cover?
Everyone.
Right.
And when I say everyone, should we break that down a little bit?
Yeah,
This
I
is gonna be
mean,
a
I
very
think
short
the
podcast.
obvious cast your net wide, and then I can think of one exception that maybe our listeners haven't thought of. They want to make sure we cover. But
Let's go through
obviously,
the obvious
employees, visitors, contractors, guests, etc. And when we say who, we mean all of those people are prohibited from making threats or engaging in any sort of violent behavior, right?
Yes.
And we prohibit threats or violent behavior against any of them.
Correct.
So it would violate the policy for an employee to make a threat against a customer, for example, right? Hopefully I don't need to say that out loud, right?
Is that a customer service pro tip?
Yes, exactly. But equally so, it would violate our policy for a customer to make a threat or engage in violence against one of our employees. Now, obviously, the policy doesn't directly apply to a customer, but it would send a message to our employees that that's not acceptable and that we would want that reported.
But I was just going to say, but the policy would cover the reporting of that. So let's take an independent contractor or a vendor, for instance. They're not subject to our employment policies, right? So if they did make a threat, there's nothing we could really do to them from an employment relationship, but the reporting obligations would certainly kick in. So our employees, when we're training them on the policy, would know that if they hear any threatening or potentially threatening language or conduct, we want to know about it, right?
Absolutely.
And that would extend if they hear that from customers, and all of that.
Okay,
so I think
the one category that I mentioned, there's a category that, and we touched on this a little bit in the last episode as well, if you recall, and that is individuals who might be related or have a relationship with one of our employees.
Yes.
Right? Acts of threats or violence, for example, by a spouse or an ex-husband or ex-girlfriend of one of our employees.
And that is a major source of workplace violence, to be clear.
Yep.
Right, spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, folks that don't work there, but who have a related person in the workplace. They know where that person is, and therefore that's where they go to commit the act of violence against that person.
Right, certainly. So you and I have both written policies that make clear to employees that if they are engaged with an individual that then comes into the workplace and makes threats or engages in violence because they are there, that would violate our policy.
Yes, and importantly, again, what can we do to someone's boyfriend, right, who's not our employee? We can't terminate them or discipline them, but we can certainly require the reporting of it, right? So if any employee becomes aware that a certain employee's boyfriend, girlfriend, et cetera, is threatening violence, we need to know about it.
Okay.
We need to be aware.
Now there is a little bit of a warning here with regard to that language in a policy, and that is, and the application of the language, I should say, and that is some states do prohibit any sort of adverse employment action against an employee because he or she is a victim of domestic violence.
Interesting.
Michigan is not one of them, but that certainly exists in many states. So what I would say is, if you have a situation like the one we just described, and you need to make a decision about what to do about it, and particularly what to do with regard to that employee who maybe didn't report it when he or she was supposed to, or was a target, and then it did result in a violation of the policy, call your legal counsel if that occurred outside of Michigan to make sure you're tracking the legal requirements in that state.
That's a great point. Let's talk about now the type of conduct that a policy should prohibit. Okay. No big surprise. We're going to cast the net pretty widely. We want to obviously include physical conduct. That goes without saying. We want to include any other conduct that is harassing, intimidating, threatening, and very importantly, we're going to prohibit that conduct no matter how it's expressed or where it's expressed.
Okay, can I just add something here?
Yes.
The word harassing.
You may.
The word harassing.
Yeah.
I think that term, employees tend to grab onto that term harassment and assign their own meaning to it.
Oh, don't they though? That's a whole nother episode.
And it's a meaning that usually is much, much broader than was intended by the person who wrote it, right? So for example, I hear a lot about employees who call, who maybe are being asked to do their job and complain that their supervisor is harassing them, right? So I agree with that, but I would encourage trying to maybe define what we mean by harassing when we use that term in policy.
Well, any of this conduct would relate to physical, emotional, or psychological harm. Right, so we're not talking about harassing. I'm with you. We could do a whole episode on examples of employees using the word harassment because they know there's legal importance to that, right? It gets everyone's attention, right? I'm being harassed because my boss doesn't like me coming in late. And they're telling me to come in on time. I got that one. I've got some other interesting ones for another show. But what we're really talking about in a workplace violence policy is any of this conduct that relates to physical, emotional, or psychological harm of another person. And when we talk about that, let's keep in mind that this type of conduct can occur anywhere. Okay. We don't want our policy limited to work hours, to workplace property, to only texts being sent on work phones, right? As I like to say, if it's impacting our business, it is our business.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love that line. I've heard you say that before too, right? So
if it impacts us, it becomes our business, and we are not going to get tripped up on when it happened, where it happened, what platform it happened on. Don't get distracted by those details. Do you agree with that?
I do very much.
Because that's often a very first question we get when an issue comes up, right? A coworker printed off a screenshot, right? Everyone thinks Snap is temporary, but of course it's not, right? Because someone sees it, does a screenshot of it, prints it off, and lays it on HR's desk, and HR says, well, this is their private Snap account. Do we really have any business doing anything about that? And my response is it impacting other employees at work. Is it impacting your workforce? It is. Well, now it's your business, right? Okay.
Yep.
So very broad.
And then, of course, finally on the what, I really do like having the policy explicitly say that even if you're just joking or if it's horseplay or something like that, it's still a violation of the policy, because that is commonly the response we hear. And it is really nice to be able to point to the policy and say, well, sorry, it really doesn't matter if you were just kidding.
Commonly, almost 100%.
Yeah.
Right? That's almost when you talk to the person that's been accused of making an inappropriate comment, whether it be under harassment policy or workplace violence policy. It's almost always it was a joke or I wasn't serious, right? Something like that. So yes, I like horseplay, joking, those sorts of things are just not excuses. Right.
So let's talk about consequences then. This, I think, is fairly straightforward, right? We want to have a statement in the policy describing what the consequences might be, but also giving us pretty broad latitude to make that decision making.
Yep. So this is a great opportunity to say something like discipline up to and including termination.
We love that phrase, right?
Yes, you really can't go wrong. That means you could do nothing, you could do something, or you could terminate employment. I have seen in this context employers move more quickly towards termination than other types of policies that almost always include that same consequence.
Sure. More of a zero tolerance if it involves employee safety.
There is certainly more of a zero tolerance. The only time I've seen there be less than a zero tolerance is maybe when we're not entirely sure, right, of what happened, right? Or the person perhaps was under the influence of alcohol, let's say, and now they're going to go into treatment, that sort of thing. So I have seen discipline less of termination from time to time. Okay. But usually termination is the most popular option because coworkers are concerned, right?
Yeah.
We said this privately as we were talking about this episode, but when something like this pops up, assume that all the employees know. Right?
That's right.
People are talking.
That's right. And sometimes you're having to make a decision between level of discipline and sending a message to all of your workforce that this is really important and you take their safety and security very seriously.
Right. And as a warning to anyone else that might want to just blow off steam, right? Has no actual intent of carrying anything out, but says pretty horrible things that do instill fear in coworkers, sends a message, we're just not going to tolerate that because we can't determine, we don't have the skill set to determine when someone is blowing off steam or when they're very serious about engaging in violent conduct, right? That's beyond our scope. So that's why we terminate usually for threats, right? Almost always.
Okay, let's talk about reporting.
Yeah, this can it sounds obvious,
yeah,
right? We want anyone to report threats of violence or violations of policy as soon as they're aware of it. But where it gets sticky is when someone, I'll just give you some real examples. One area of stickiness, if you will, is when an employee says, I heard something that really concerns me. I'm scared, but I'm afraid to tell you what it is and who said it because I'm afraid they'll find out I reported them, right?
Yeah. So, fair enough.
So what?
Right? Sure.
Yes.
I mean, I can understand why they would feel that way and why that would be a legitimate concern. So what do we tell them? And what should the policy say about that?
Yeah, so I like a statement similar to our harassment policies, which is confidentiality will be kept as much as possible, but we can't make a blanket promise of confidentiality. This is certainly an area, though, where as HR and as leadership in the organization, we should take care to protect the person's identity as much as we can, but we can't make any full-on promises. You have an obligation in that moment to protect your entire workforce, right? So you have to make the judgment call as to whether identifying that person is necessary to protect your workplace or not.
Usually what I see is that it's less about identifying that reporter by name, right? Employers usually wouldn't do that, but by following up on the report, that individual will know who reported it by virtue of the situation.
Yes.
Right? Maybe it was a threat only directed at them and they were the only one to know about it. Well, obviously, if you're going to follow up on it, then the individual who committed the threat or potential act of violence is going to know who reported it.
I've seen it come up with when it's a person that the individual being accused of engaging in violent threats, their significant other, for instance, someone that is not your employee, calls you and makes a report, but then says, please don't tell so-and-so that I'm the one that told you.
Oh, right.
Right, that he or she has guns in the house and is because I'm afraid that they'll take it out on me. So I've seen that happen on more than one occasion, and the response is the same, right? We're comforting, we're calming, but we can't make promises we can't keep.
Okay.
Right.
So encourage the reporting, emphasize the effort to keep confidentiality. I liked the words you used as much as possible. And then I would say in this policy, you would want to really specifically identify the individual to whom the report would be made. And I think that is a intentional decision when that policy is written, right? Who is going to be the person to field these reports of potential violence or violence in the workplace? Who's going to be available? Who's going to be the best person to handle them? Et cetera, right? And then the policy should really specify who that person is.
Completely agree. Yep. Okay. So now let's talk about, so those are all the four major categories. Let's go through a few real life examples, Sarah, because
all right. We've seen some, unfortunately, right?
We have, this is just a recurring type of question, right? When you're doing counseling work in the employment law area, we get calls like this month in and month out. Normally we talk about themes. I wouldn't say this is a theme right now, but it's on people's minds because of the recent news, right, of the horrific shootings across the country. This summer, certainly workplace violence is on people's minds, right? So the policy work is on people's minds, even though the specific incidents, luckily, are not heating up right now. So I'll give you one, and then you give me one.
Okay. All right. That's fair.
Okay. So here's a.
Don't take mine though. I've got one in my head, but okay.
As much as possible, I won't. As much as possible, I won't. All right, so I'm going to combine a few client questions into one. This is not in case any of my clients that have called me on these issues are watching. This is not based on any one call, but this is a kind of a hybrid of several questions I've received over the years. Okay, so HR supervisor is in their office on what was a quiet day when they had nothing going on, nothing to do at all.
That's unrealistic. That would never happen.
Right, and that because that's when these calls come in.
Yes,
right?
Yes, okay.
So a call, the phone rings. The ID is not familiar to the HR supervisor. Supervisor picks up the phone, and it's a very nervous woman on the other end of the line. Mm-hmm. And she identifies herself as an employee's wife, but soon to be ex-wife. They're going through a messy divorce. And as part of that process, she has heard her husband, soon to be ex-husband, express how angry he is at his supervisor and at the company. She knows that her soon-to-be ex-husband has multiple weapons. And while he has not said anything specific, right, he has not said, and on Tuesday, I'm going to go to the workplace, right, and shoot X, Y, or Z, or do specific things. Right. She is concerned based on his level of hostility towards the company in general, the amount of stress the person is under right now, and sometimes they tell you the person has a mental illness or a history of a mental illness that maybe USHR did not know about. And then they usually end the conversation with something like, I just thought you should know.
Right.
And then they hang up the phone. I just thought you should know.
Here you go.
I don't know what you should do with it. I don't want to be responsible, but I thought you should know. Okay. So that happens, right? So Sarah, how should the HR person react after that call? There's a few messy pieces to this, right? Should we start with the source of the information?
Right. Well, we don't know whether it's credible or not, right? We don't know anything about the person who called. The key for me is we just don't know. We don't have enough information to determine whether or not that information is credible or not. Can
I be the HR person in this?
Yes.
Okay. But Sarah, I don't want to get involved in my employees' private lives, right? They're going through a messy divorce. Mm-hmm. I think she may be using this somehow, right, as leverage in the divorce. I've never been through divorce. I don't know how that works, but I just have this feeling that maybe she's lying. right? That this is really more about
she's just
what's
trying
going
to
on
get
in their
back at
personal
him.
lives, and I don't want to get involved.
Okay.
Right, in our employees. Divorces are messy personal lives. So can I just push it aside based on that? I hinted at the answer, but what would your answer be?
I mean, I think the answer would be no. You've gotten information that an employee could be a threat in the workplace. And your own policy probably says that is supposed to be reported and followed up on.
Back to the policy.
If you've adopted the policy as we've advised you to, right? So I would say no, we should not automatically discount information like that based on our opinion on a phone call like that, right? Based on the level of information that HR person had about the individual who made the call, I would say I wouldn't automatically discount it, no.
What about the fact that there wasn't a specific threat made, right? There are two pieces of information, very angry, hostile, actually three, going through significant personal stress at the moment and has access to firearms. And we're kind of piecing that together to think there might be a threat, but he didn't actually make a threat. So is it fair?
It's her opinion that he might be a threat.
Yes. So what do we do with that as an employer?
Certainly one option would be to talk to the employee and see how he's doing, right? Try to assess whether or not he's a threat. I've had conversations with HR folks about that before. Some feel comfortable doing that, some do not.
Right.
It's certainly, we know from last week that our local police departments and sheriff's offices are actually quite willing to help in situations like this, quite willing to do wellness checks, welfare checks, talk to somebody in a situation like this. And so it wouldn't be out of course to reach out to our contact, right? As we know from last week, there's usually a liaison for businesses in that local department, and call that individual and tell them what information you have and get their guidance on what they think should be done. They will often follow up with that individual.
I like that a lot. I think also if we can take the workplace violence aspect out of this and think about it as any other complaint of employee misconduct and just find out what actually happened, right? Let's not skip that step. I would actually call back the person who made the call with some follow-up questions, because you were probably taken off guard.
If you can.
When that call came in, right? And say, I need specifics, right? Tell me exactly what was said, when, were these in text, was this on social media, do you have copies, right? All the things you would do. And the same thing with the employee. What specifically, you said, I understand you're mad at Supervisor Bob, but what specifically, right, have you said? And then if there is threatening language or conduct, that's the point of the policy, right? We don't have to get to the person's intentions at that point. We don't have to figure out, are they actually going to carry out on it? Are they actually a threat? The fact that they made the threatening statements, in my opinion, is certainly enough to violate the policy. Then are you going to discipline or terminate becomes the question. But what I like about preventing the conduct and not the intent, right, is we don't have to try to unravel that and figure it out.
If the conduct
because
occurred.
frankly,
Right,
oftentimes it's very, very difficult, right? I mean, even the professionals, right?
Yep.
Professional law enforcement, et cetera, have trouble with that. So
Yep.
that's
I
the way
think
I would
that's
handle
right.
it.
Okay.
Okay, so give me one.
All right. So you use my example. So we're going to move on to the next to the next type of policy.
I said as much as possible.
Yes, exactly. Yes. I think that's fine.
So let's talk about
weapons.
weapons.
We've got a little bit of time left. Let's talk about weapons policies.
Yes, weapons policies. And I don't know why, but a few years ago we did go through a phase where we got lots of requests, right, regarding weapons policies. And it's interesting, this topic, people come at it from different points of view, right? So there's two extremes. We'll talk about both of those, and then the middle. One extreme is a 100% weapons-free workplace, right? No weapons of any kind, under any circumstances, anywhere on the property, including locked in your personal car, right? And then the other is we feel safer if the employees we trust do have weapons, or at least some of them do. So we're okay with that, right? But we are going to put some limits on them, right? We're going to talk about that.
Sure.
maybe having employees sign off on something. But this is an area where opinions about weapons in the workplace, whether that makes it more dangerous or less dangerous, there's room for disagreement on that. So we're going to talk about the range, and then of course there's the middle. Right, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say too, there's some workplaces where employees have to carry weapons as part of their job, obviously, as well, right? And yes, there's the middle. I've got certainly I've had clients who have a pretty strict no weapons policy, but then have made occasional exceptions for employees who maybe have to travel to more dangerous places, enter abandoned homes and things like that to do some work. So, and they allow those individuals to carry a weapon for specific purposes with some sort of signed agreement with the employee.
Well, let's talk about the weapons-free policies first. Those tend to be the most common. We work on. So just like the workplace violence policies, right, we're going to have some definitions and they're going to be pretty broad. Just as a spoiler alert, we're going to define where the policy applies, the physical place the policy applies to, and we're going to want to include every employer's piece of property, right, including parking lots, including when they're on customers' properties, et cetera. So our own physical property, and then anywhere they happen to be performing their work duties.
So I have to do my multi-state warning here, right? I do this at least once an episode, right?
Well, we could probably bring it up more if we really wanted to scare people, frankly.
So, right, for our listeners who have employees in operations outside of Michigan, and really in any state outside of Michigan, states have a broad array of what is permitted and what is not. In some states, require employers to allow employees to have weapons, particularly locked in their car.
Yes,
right?
There was a legislative movement across the whole country a few years ago, right, where local gun chapters, NRA chapters, there were draft legislation, right, drafted nationally, and then they were trying to have that adopted across the country in each state legislature, and some were successful and some were not.
So we'll have to take that into account.
Yes.
When you're thinking about the where,
Yes.
You're going to also need to think about what states this would apply in. In the Midwest is sort of a heartland of states in which we're going to have to make some exceptions there.
Yep, absolutely. We're going to want to define what a weapon is. Obviously, firearms.
Well, good point.
Right? I'm not stepping out on a limb by saying firearms, but we probably want to make it a little broader to any object that can cause physical harm
that
to
could hurt somebody.
Coworkers that they don't need to perform their work duties.
Yeah. So I mean, that could be almost anything, right? You could take any object and hurt somebody. So HR folks would say, "Well, I'm going to get pushed back there." Does that mean I can't have my softball bat in the car if I've got a game after work, et cetera, right? So we can add some context to that too.
Yep.
They're probably for objects that aren't typically used to cause harm, right? That's not their intended use, right? That might have to be tied to some sort of intent to use it in that way.
Perfect. Yep. I love it. So that talks about the where and the what's. In a weapons policy, we also want to make sure the employer reserves the right to search employees' personal property. Depending on the state, there can be different, sorry folks, but there can be different standards for what counts as invasion of personal property, right? So we want to make sure you've reserved the authority for yourself to search lockers, purses, backpacks, cars, right? Not that you're always going to do that, because who has the time to do that every day? But certainly when there's cause or reasonable suspicion, right, you want to make sure you've reserved that right for yourself.
And that would often come up in the context of receiving a report.
Yes.
I will add too that I have had situations like that in which an employer received a report, maybe that Sarah has a gun in her locker, and she's telling people that she's got a gun in her locker, right?
Yep.
And there's an implied threat there that she might use it in the workplace. Let me be clear. We're not saying for a second that the HR representative should necessarily be the individual to confront Sarah and search her locker. That would be a circumstance in which I would absolutely involve law enforcement.
Good point.
And make sure you've, that's a pretty serious threat, right?
Yes.
The searching is usually more along the lines of weapons that are less dangerous, maybe they have, or stolen property, things like that.
So let's talk about, real quick, folks that want to allow weapons, right? So either the middle or the other end of the spectrum. Weapons policies that are permissive to some extent. And then let's wrap up with agreements, because I know you've worked on those, right? Agreements you would have employees sign in those situations. So what do policies look like, Sarah, that are permissive?
Yeah, so that takes careful thought, and those really are individualized based on the employer and where they're located. It's hard to generalize, right? We want to be as specific as possible as to what is allowed. And I really, really like always saying that even if we might allow weapons into a workplace, each individual employee needs to have permission, and have signed some sort of acknowledgement or an agreement. We want to make sure they've got legal authorization to have the weapon in the first place.
Right,
For example, we want to make sure that they've been trained to use it.
Yes.
We want to make sure they understand that just because they're being allowed to have it, we're not giving them permission to use it. And certainly we're not giving them permission to inflict harm, except in maybe extremely, extremely limited circumstances. So it really does take some careful thought. And that conversation is very helpful to have.
Yep.
When we're thinking about a weapons policy. I've had lots of conversations with clients who feel strongly that it can be helpful to allow employees to have weapons, yet when we start talking about asking those questions and talking through those things, they realize that can be more challenging than they realize because they lose that control. Right?
Yep.
Over the use.
Yep, exactly.
And so you've got to be very selective.
Perfect. Well, this was a really serious topic. So we had a little less fun, I think, than we normally do, but we hope it was valuable to everyone watching and listening.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Time to get back to work.
All right.
Bye, Sarah.
Bye.